Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Navaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. We're excited to have you here with us, myself and JP. Great to see you, JP.
Great to see you.
So today we want to talk about the idea of decision-making and willpower as how it pertains to the kind of biochemistry, the biomechanics, and the biophysiology side of it, and what we can potentially do to improve our willpower, our decision-making, maybe go towards more positive and not allow for life to kind of push us in the direction that it chooses. So we've got a few research articles we want to discuss today, and a lot of it pertains to the concept of the Marshmallow test, which is a very unique and very important test, I believe, when it comes to understanding human psychology. And for those who don't know what the Marshmallow test is, JP, why don't you give us a brief introduction to the original Marshmallow test that was completed, and then we can talk about kind of the progression of that test as it's gone on.
Sure. Walter Mischel at Stanford University back in, I believe, the early 1970s, conceived of this study in which he took children aged 4 or 5 years old and individually met with them and explained to them that he was going to give them a marshmallow and that they had the ability to eat the marshmallow at any time that they wanted, but that he had to leave the room. So they were isolated in a room, sitting at a desk, the marshmallow on a plate right in front of them. But he was going to leave the room for about 15 minutes. He claimed that he had to go to his car for something. And that when he came back, if the child had not eaten the marshmallow, he would give the child a second marshmallow so the child could have double the treat. And all the children that he worked with had to sort of understand the concept that they were being confronted with and the benefits of waiting. And if they did, then he would leave the room and he would video them to see whether or not they could keep themselves occupied and prevent themselves from eating the marshmallow. Now, some of them did and some of them didn't. As you would imagine with children, that's how it goes. He then did something very interesting, and his group followed the children over a period of really a remarkable period of about 30 years. And over that period, he looked to see what differences those children exhibited in their lives, how the trajectory of their lives differed based on whether or not the child had been able to delay gratification. His focus was if the child had the ability to delay gratification at age 5, that would tend to lead them to make better decisions throughout life. And so, sure enough, his findings suggested that the children, when they were adolescents, were more friendly, more capable of doing good work in school, were generally just, I don't want to call them better kids, but they seemed to be by adult standards on the right path. And then when they got to sort of late teenage years, they went to better colleges as measured by academic difficulty. And they went on from there to look at what kind of jobs these kids ultimately got and how much money they made, and whether or not their marriages were stable. And they even went so far about 30 years later to do fMRI studies on their brains. And what they found was that the children who had been able to delay gratification, had gotten that second marshmallow by waiting, had a sort of a different way that their brains worked, that they were capable of visualizing the future in ways that the kids who ate the marshmallow right up front seemed to not have. And so he extrapolated from that the ability to delay gratification was this all-important feature that led these children to have better lives.
Yeah, it's one of the most well-known research studies that's been out there, and that obviously like a 30-year study looking at decision-making, willpower, and the longitudinal effects of a decision to delay gratification on a single marshmallow or a second is such a unique and such a powerful test. It does require the assumption that more is better, and that is one assumption that in our discussions you've mentioned that I believe is a fair assumption to have to make, that a second marshmallow or two marshmallows is better than one.
At least for 4 and 5
For
year
4 and
olds.
5-year-olds, yes, absolutely. For adults, it probably still is, but it's an assumption that does need to be made. So I'll just put that little caveat as my mild issue with the assumption required. That said,
Right. And I've got a bigger issue, which is most people will read the articles that have been written about this and take from it that having this ability to defer gratification is the cause of all these wonderful things or negative things that happened in these people's lives. And I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between causation and correlation. And we see this throughout life. We see this throughout many different situations where people mistake causation for correlation or correlation for causation. And so what I'm saying here is it's highly unlikely that people were able to have a change in their entire lives based on whether or not they ate or didn't eat a marshmallow. What's more likely is that these children had an innate ability that existed within them to either distract themselves or think through it, or as we'll discuss, their autonomic nervous systems allowing them to remain calm and to trust the adult who was telling them this. And we'll get to a twist on the experiment where trust is a really big piece of this. And that is really the cause of both the ability to defer gratification at the marshmallow stage, as well as all of the other decisions in life that are important, where being willing to put aside what you want right now in order to achieve the goal, the larger goal of being successful or having a great marriage or having wonderful kids and those sorts of things, good relationships. And I always use the example when I explain the difference between causation and correlation as the example of, do ice cream trucks cause sunburns? And the answer is no. Ice cream trucks obviously don't cause sunburns, but a sunny day at the beach oftentimes brings ice cream trucks to try to sell ice cream to kids. And the sunny days at the beach lead people who are not otherwise normally out in the sun to go out to the beach, and they get sunburned. So there's a common cause. The common cause is it's a sunny summer day, and it brings both of those things to bear. So I think that's what I'm trying to suggest here is likely the cause, and which is this autonomic nervous system, this capability of being calm, making a good decision that's underlying both the short-term decision about the marshmallow as well as the long-term decisions in life. And I think they don't seem to talk about that. They seem to talk only about good decision making, but not really explain why the good decision making exists in some people at age 4 or 5 and not in others.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll attest to this idea. You have kids, I have kids, mine are younger than yours. The ice cream truck works for real. And there's another correlation causation that can occur here, that those who eat a standard American diet that generally is higher in sugar and higher processed foods is also correlated to sunburn in that particular kind of circumstance. And so there are some biochemical kind of features that may allow for it, but it's not to say that it is the cause directly, right? There is potential correlation that does occur, and ice cream trucks and sunburn have nearly no direct biochemical correlation, but they are biochemical causation to them. But there is absolutely a correlation based on the time, the weather, the experience. And a sunny day in Florida where you are versus a sunny day in Toronto where I am may not always result in ice cream trucks coming out, but a warm sunny day will. Absolutely.
For sure. The interesting way that this study was altered in a subsequent experiment that was conducted, I think is really revealing as to why it's not simply deferred gratification being the causation. And so what these new experimenters did was they took these children and they did exactly the same thing with exposing them to a marshmallow and then telling them that they were going to go away for 15 minutes. But before they did that, they sort of primed the children into two categories. In one category, the adult who was going to ultimately give them the marshmallow and then promise to come back with a second one was shown to be a very honest person, and in the relationship with the child. So the individual brings the child in and promises the child a very cool art set, with lots of different features and lots of different things that the child can play with. And then leaves and comes back and brings, in the case of being an honest person, a really cool art set. In the case of being dishonest, the other group was where they showed that the adult was a dishonest person. The person came back with like a used box of crayons and tossed it on the table, and the child was disappointed. That priming of either the adult that they're interacting with being honest versus dishonest was very, very powerful in priming them for the subsequent test. And so what they then did was they did the marshmallow test. They gave the kid a marshmallow and said, I'm going to come back in 15 minutes, and if you don't eat the marshmallow, I'll give you a second one. All of the children, all of them, where the adult had been dishonest, ate the marshmallow. And you can see how that changed the child, even though some of those children might have otherwise been those who didn't, eat the marshmallow, waited, because they felt that that adult was dishonest or that they couldn't trust that adult. They couldn't hold out. And the most fascinating part of that to me is the fact that they videotaped these children. And what they saw was not that the child, as soon as the adult left, they ate the marshmallow. They still tried. They still tried to hold on. They still tried to distract themselves. They still tried, but they just couldn't do it. And so you have to ask yourself, what is going on inside that child's mind that the child is trying, but because of that priming, because of that experience of dishonesty with the adult, led the child to not be able to do it. And the converse is also true. Almost all of the children where the adult had been shown to be honest were capable of waiting, far a higher percentage than had been in the original study. And so when you think about it, I want to sort of make a parallel here because it's a really, I think, very instructive with respect to what we're talking about, is how lie detectors work. Okay, so lie detectors, we've all seen the movie scenes where a person's strapped into a chair and you've got, various different electrodes all over their body and their brain. And there's this thing that looks almost like a seismograph that's taking, these wavy measurements off the person. Well, what those various different measurements are doing in a real lie detector test is measuring your autonomic functions. Things like heart rate, things like breathing, sweating, and even pupil dilation in the really complex versions of lie detectors. So these polygraphs, and poly meaning many and graph meaning many lines, because they're actually measuring lots of different autonomic functions. What they're testing is how your body, your autonomic nervous system, is responding to having to lie versus telling the truth. And it's fascinating how human psychology works. It's likely because of the safety associated with the truth. Lying or even hearing somebody else lie. And that's another way that polygraphs have not yet been used, but I think there's ultimately a strong scientific basis for using polygraphs on other people while somebody else is telling a lie that they know is a lie. Because even listening to another person tell a lie can cause your autonomic nervous system, if you know it's a lie, to react. That's why sometimes we have a gut feeling that a person is lying. You have that sense that you're being told something that's not true. And that's because your autonomic nervous system can pick up on all the cues that the other person is giving off that he or she is lying. And so the fact that the autonomic nervous system can sense untruth, can sense mistrust, that is how these children are having their autonomic nervous systems shifted by the adult that's lying.
And thus their decision-making accordingly as well.
Exactly. And so to me, it's fascinating because I think it shows how the autonomic nervous system might really be the underlying cause of why some of these children end up being happier, healthier, and smarter as a result throughout their lives, as evidenced by their relationships with others, their performance in school, their decision making with respect to their careers. All of those things, and even how their brains function, seems to indicate that these are children who have an innately high level of parasympathetic activity versus sympathetic activity And we know that the parasympathetic activity is associated with safety, rest, digest, restore mode versus your sympathetic level where you're anxious, you're stressed, you're in fight or flight mode. Because, in the case of the second experiment, the kids were hearing a lie.
I think this is such a huge kind of revelation, particularly for parents, right? Where when you're in a parental situation, when you're with your kids and you're talking about something or you're sharing like, we're going to do this, and you're being ideally honest and your kids trust you, they're actually being primed to be able to feel that safety, to experience that trust with an adult, trust with the world, trust that the world will take care of them when they're in the life situation where they require the care of somebody else to be there, right? When they require the care of an adult. And it goes really to show kind of the polyvagal theory as well, that when we are in this state of safety, of comfort, of trust, when we don't feel abandoned, when we don't feel as though adults have lied to us, then we are far more primed to be in that parasympathetic kind of that green state. If you ever look at the polyvagal theory stages, which is parasympathetic, safe, comfortable, reliable, relaxed, and thus you can make better decisions, because when we're in a parasympathetic state, decision making is far more logical. It uses a lot more of the prefrontal cortex. It uses a lot more of the machinery that we have to instill and utilize executive function, versus when we're in the sympathetic or in that fawn kind of freeze state where our hindbrain becomes the primary driver of our thinking and our decision making. And that's really, it's shown by fMRI study that blood flow goes to those particular areas more so when we're in a parasympathetic versus sympathetic state. So it really goes to show how we as parents, as adults, as those entrusted with the care of young ones around us, if we are not trustworthy, can actually drive generational challenges for the children around us to make great decisions later, because we're then potentially priming them to not trust adults if we're not being trustworthy.
Yeah, they've actually done additional studies, and you and I have both read some of these, and we'll post them in the links. Studies with athletes, studies with decision makers in the capital markets and finance, even with the police and law enforcement. And they've done studies looking at the ability to make critical decisions, in the case of law enforcement, life and death decisions, and looking at their autonomic nervous system state to see how well they make good decisions when their autonomic nervous system is primed into a sympathetic state versus allowed to remain in the parasympathetic state. And across the board, whether it's financial decisions, legal decisions, game decisions, all of these things function so much better, and the outcomes are so much more positive when the person's innate level of activation is more directed toward the parasympathetic. I'll give you one example, which I learned about many, many years ago. The NFL and used to, and they may still do, a test on players. And they take these players and they put them on a treadmill, and they get their heart rate up to within 90% of their maximum. So these players are really exhausted. And then they begin asking these players difficult questions about the game. What play, where they should be on a certain play, what type of defensive scheme they're looking at, that sort of thing. And players who have the ability to still make good decisions in that contrived setting where they're on a treadmill, mimicking that flight mode from an autonomic perspective, those people are still able to make good decisions, inevitably are the best players on the field in the games. Those are the ones that you can rely on. Those are the captains of the team. Those are the ones that they're the stars. Yeah. In fact, the story goes that the best player ever to handle that was Lawrence Taylor. Not being a big fan of the Giants, but that's okay. I happen to be a Bears fan. I hope we didn't lose any listeners as a result of that. But he apparently was phenomenal at being able to get his heart rate up to that kind of level and make good decisions. Now, sort of thinking about it from a parental standpoint, I think is really important. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because being a parent, anybody who's a parent knows that a little child will immediately say, "Oh, you're lying," even when it's just a function of the fact that circumstances didn't work out the way that they said that we thought it would. So they're very, very attuned to whether or not a person is lying versus not lying. But I want to translate that, and without getting too political. In fact, I'm going to try not to be political at all. But we all live as adults with bosses. We live with people who have influence over our lives in really important ways. I mean, obviously the police, but politicians and people who are in government, they have the ability to really affect our lives in positive and negative ways. And if we believe that those people are lying to us, it's very disruptive to our autonomic nervous system state. Mm-hmm. And so if we live in communities where the government, or in countries where the government regularly is using untruth as a tool to try to manipulate us, we recognize that. And we don't just recognize it in our brains. We recognize it in our autonomic nervous system, in our immune system, which we've talked many, many times about how those two things are linked together, and even with respect to our cellular metabolism and our health. So it's critically important that we understand the effect that we're having on our health when we're being dishonest.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more that when we are exposed to all of these things, like, who hasn't heard of a politician lying to get into office or to get your vote, right? Like, doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, you've heard this and you've experienced this. So we're not going to get political here, but the whole idea is trust. And the whole idea is, can you control your personal state? Can you avoid going down those rabbit holes that create more of those distrust with particular sides, one side or the other? Can you avoid creating those challenges within yourself? And I just want to bring it back to the lie detector, because I think this is where a really cool concept comes up, that people have actually learned how to beat lie detector tests, right? We've got CIA operatives, we've got potentially politicians, we've got a lot of people that have learned how to beat the test. And what they're doing is they're instilling actual tactics of breadth and of internal willpower to actually shift their autonomic function, which means that we as humans actually have the ability to create autonomic control, or to actually control the state that we're in. And this is the absolute difference between kind of a mediocre lower end athlete and somebody who's a superstar on the field, is that ability to control their autonomic function and be able to shift into a better decision-making capacity, being able to literally create a physiological shift. What are some of the tools that we can utilize as individuals to help strengthen the ability to shift that state?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the ticket, because what you really want to do is return as frequently as possible into a parasympathetic recovery state. Because the longer you remain in a sympathetically driven state, the more likely it is that you're going to drive yourself into an inflamed state, suffer either mental or physical breakdown as a result. So it's really important to get back into that parasympathetic recovery mode as frequently as possible. And some of the great tools, you mentioned a couple, deep breathing techniques. Another one that I sort of joke about, we've talked about, I think once or twice, is I tell people, you don't have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom. Okay. You're an adult now. And holding it, literally holding it, is something that does trigger your autonomic nervous system into sympathetic mode. Yeah. So go to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom. I realize it sounds almost humorous to have to say that to people, but people don't do it. We have to forcibly take bio breaks. No, if you have to go to the bathroom, excuse yourself and go, because your body will appreciate it, your brain will appreciate it, and your autonomic nervous system will function better. Same thing with being hungry. We're locked into this breakfast, lunch, and dinner kind of mode, we're looked at. It's kind of strange if you're eating off hours sometimes, or if you don't eat when you're hungry.
Yeah.
And don't eat when you're not. I mean, if you're doing an intermittent fasting thing, then certainly then you have a reason why you're holding off on eating, even though you're hungry. But don't do it that frequently. Do it intermittently. And the reason for that is because when you're hungry, it triggers your autonomic nervous system into that fight or flight mode. You're suddenly, your whole being is directed towards, I'm hungry and I need to get food. I need nutrients to survive. Another one that I really talk to people about a lot is walking, getting out and exercising. And it doesn't have to be, high impact training or running a marathon or anything like that. Just getting out and walking is a tremendously valuable thing for people to do. It is a great signal to your body and your brain and your nervous system that you're healthy, and that everything is working properly. So if you can get up and walk, and it doesn't have to be an hour on the treadmill. It could be taking a walk around the block, taking deep breaths while you're doing it. All of those things are great ways to get back into that parasympathetic recovery state, which will help you make good decisions for all the reasons that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really interesting research showing that there's a connection between vagus nerve stimulation potentially and the ability to make better decisions. Why don't we dig a little bit into that in the last few minutes we have here?
Sure. Well, I think we've talked before about the fact that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is DARPA, those are the super geniuses who've come up with everything from night vision goggles to hypersonic jet planes. They have been studying neuromodulation now for a while. And specifically, they've come to the conclusion that vagus nerve stimulation, which is the artificial activation of a parasympathetic nervous system, that can have a performance-enhancing benefits or instill performance enhancement for people ranging from pilots to special forces to people in the CIA trying to learn new languages. So all of that cognitive enhancement really is tied very closely to your ability to use your parasympathetic recovery mode as a touch point, a touchstone, getting yourself and your whole system back in alignment. It's just so much easier to think clearly. We tell people in our own language, we tell people to sleep on decisions. Take a moment, take a deep breath. We tell people to do these things because we know that we make better decisions from them. We think more clearly as a result. Take a walk around the block. Go take a walk. Go relax. And the reason for that is because when you take those steps to move yourself back into a parasympathetic state, you activate that prefrontal cortex. The connections between your prefrontal cortex and your central executive function is just working better. You're able to make better assessments as to whether or not the things you're planning, the things you're thinking of as potential actions really are the right ones to take. And so for all those reasons, vagus nerve stimulation or vagus nerve activation really helps you make better decisions.
Yeah, I'd recommend this to anybody who's listening who wants a little bit more proof in real life scenarios to truly go and watch. I'm a baseball guy. You're kind of a football guy a bit more than I am. But watch the best players compared to some of the more mediocre players. And just watch what they do, watch how they breathe, become a little bit more curious as to what are the specific things that allowed Michael Jordan to stay at like the peak performer that he was into his late 30s, right? Why was he capable of literally taking over a game? It was because he was able to control his decision-making and his breath to do so, right? He was gassed at the end of a game, but he was still, if you watch him, he was still tongue out, ensuring that he was breathing effectively to make the best decisions that he could, right? Watch the best hitters at the plate in baseball. Watch the best quarterbacks who are making the toughest decisions when they're being blitzed on, like, what do they have to do in that moment to ensure that they move the ball down the field and further and ensure that they hit with pinpoint accuracy a guy who's 30 yards downfield.
the guy that I like to talk about in this is not only LeBron James. I'm not a huge. I'm more of a Michael Jordan fan, but LeBron James, even in his advertisements, talks about the fact that the great athletes are playing the game in their minds.
Mm-hmm.
They're not playing the game on the floor. They're playing the game in their minds. And Kobe Bryant, wonderful guy, used to talk about this also, the mental aspects of the game. Michael Jordan even talks about the fact that and Kobe talks about, by the time he gets out on the court, he's already played this
Mm-hmm.
game. Every aspect of this game has already been played out in his head. He's just now sort of replaying it in reality. And what does that do? By playing the game in your mind, by visualizing it before you do it, it takes the stress out of it. You're no longer having to make the decision in a split second while you're on the court. You're not making decisions. You're simply just recognizing what decision needs to be copied because you've already done it. I used to do that before going out to play golf just to see how it worked, because I'm obviously not going to get out on a basketball court and be dunking the way those guys are. But what I found was that if I visualized my game, I knew the course that I was going to go play on, I would spend, 10 or 15 minutes before going out on the course just imagining playing the course, playing that hole, playing each hole, what I do at different positions. So when I got to the point of actually having to take the stroke, I'd already done it. I was just basically replaying that stroke. And we all know, because if you're a golfer, you've experienced this. It's always easier to hit the second shot that you take better than the first one. Okay. So if you've already taken the first one in your mind, then the actual shot you take is the second one.
This is where you and I relate entirely, because I do the exact same thing before I go for a round of golf. And not to say that I play a lot of different courses, but I look it up and I make sure, okay, on the third hole, it's straight away 450 yards. I'm hitting driver, right? Like I know. And so I'm getting up, and it's a quick, easy get up there and get yourself going and know where you're trying to hit it. And are you fading the ball? Are you a little bit more of a slicer, so you're going to overcompensate, or are you drawing it in, and where are you trying to hit it? And if you don't have that kind of mental processing prior, it becomes much more difficult, because you're walking up almost blind to what you're dealing with, and you're dealing with it the first time in reality versus dealing with it for the first time in your head, knowing what's coming, which I think is huge from a performance standpoint. And I'm still working on breaking 90, but you and we're going to play a couple of rounds, I'm sure, at some point real soon to get me closer to that goal.
For sure. And I'll tell you, the other thing that I've seen on the course is that people will go out, and if you're doing business on the course, talking business, and lots of people do that. People who pick up their phones and take a phone call in the middle of a hole, they do not play that hole, the rest of the hole well. They become distracted. They're not in the zone. They're not remaining in that parasympathetic state. Especially if it's a business call. I mean, they might as well just pick up the ball. In fact, I will tell you that some of the top people in business that I've played with, if that happens to them, they pick up the ball and they don't play the rest of that hole. They walk with everyone, but they just say, I know I'm out of this hole. I had to take that call. I'm out of this hole. If I play this hole, I'm going to blow up. It's going to be terrible. And then when I get to the next hole, I'm going to be stressed from how I played the last one. So I'm just going to pick the ball up. I'll play the next hole. And they can recover so much more quickly because they took the time to walk, be again, on the course, take a deep breath, and they recover from the brief shifting out of the parasympathetic state that they're forced into as a result of the phone call.
I can't tell you how many notifications I have at the end of a 4.5 hour round of golf, because I do not look at any of my notifications. My wife knows if she needs to reach me, she calls my playing partner so that I can beat them on that hole.
So you can wreck his game.
It's awesome. I never thought that our conversation would go down the rabbit hole from marshmallow tests down to how to play golf really effectively. But I love this conversation. It was really good. Any final words as we wrap it up today?
No, I think it was crazy. We went from a cylindrical white thing to a round white thing. It was a great conversation, and I would suggest to anybody, we're going to post a couple of papers. If you're interested in the Stanford Marshmallow Test, read up on it. It's a really fascinating test. Dr. Mitchell actually ended up writing a book on the Marshmallow Test. I think it's still in print. It's a good read if you're interested, and it could change how you approach the decision making in your life.
It's such a wonderful way to end it. And just to kind of talk about what we can do, I've got Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life up here on the side, which is a fun thing that I do. But rule number 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. I think that's huge, because when you lie, you are creating autonomic dysfunction or a disparity between the truth and where you're putting the world out. So tell the truth, not only to your kids, not only to the world, but to yourself. And I think
honesty is the best policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Great words to end on. Thank you so much for this wonderful call, JP. And for those who are still listening, thanks for listening. Share this with one person that you think could benefit from this information. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one. Wishing you upgraded health.